Hello everyone, and welcome to Think Academy AP Language Lesson 5. We are now on to the multiple choice section of the test. So first 4 lessons talked about the response questions, and lessons 5 and 6 will focus on multiple choice. Today we're going to be talking about multiple choice questions in general just a little bit, and then we'll mostly focus on reading passages and reading questions. There are 2 different types of questions and 2 different types of passages in the AP Language multiple choice section. There's reading and there's writing. We're going to be talking about reading mostly in lesson 5, and then we'll talk about writing in lesson 6. So on the multiple choice section, you have 1 hour to complete the section. There are 5 total passages, and there are 45 questions split up among those 5 passages. So if you kind of do the math a little bit, that means you have 12 minutes per passage, 1 minute and 20 seconds per question. Obviously, these are just averages, right? These are approximate ideas of how much time you have for each. You can spend more time on some questions, less time on other questions. You'll spend some time on the passage itself before you even get to the questions, right? So don't feel like you have to stick to this, but this just gives you a general idea of approximately how much time each question should be taking you. As I mentioned, there are reading questions and writing questions, and the difference is that reading questions are focused on what the author is saying or how or she is saying it. They're focused kind of on the content of the passage, what the passage is actually saying, right? It's your understanding of what's actually going on in the passage. 2 passages, I believe the first 2 passages for the multiple choice section will be reading passages with reading questions. So not only are the reading questions different from the writing questions, but the passages that accompany reading questions are different than the passages that you use for writing questions. And the way you can tell if you have a reading passage is that it is excerpted or adapted from an existing work. So it might be, a novel, a chapter of a novel, or an excerpt from a novel, or it might be a letter that was written sometime in the past from some politician to someone or something like that. Or it might be a speech that was given somewhere. If it tells you that it's an excerpt or that it's adapted from a completed existing work, it's a reading passage, and the questions that accompany it are going to be reading questions. Writing questions, on the other hand, don't focus on what the passage is saying, but they focus on changing the passage to make it more effective. If you've taken the SAT, this is kind of a little bit more similar to the writing and language section, whereas the reading questions are a little bit more similar to the reading section of the SAT. Not exactly the same, though, but that's kind of more in line with what you're doing. You are adding things, taking things away, changing things to make the writing better. 3 passages will be writing passages with writing questions, and you can identify them because they are incomplete drafts. It'll tell you at the beginning this passage is a draft, and there will also be numbers before each sentence. Every sentence will be numbered in writing passages. That way, when you get to the questions, it can say, in sentence 6, this happens. So that's the difference between the 2. Reading is what we're going to focus on today, and we'll focus on writing in lesson 6. So reading questions ask about what the passage says. They ask about how the author conveys information, the different rhetorical choices they might use to convey information. They might ask about why the author is writing about the topic. They might ask about how different parts of the passage relate to each other. They may ask about themes and ideas that are present throughout the passage, and any other concepts related to the content of the passage. What is written, why it's written that way, those sorts of things. And in order to answer some of the questions, you may need to have an understanding of multiple different parts of the passage. For example, questions that ask about how different parts of the passage relate to each other. There are also questions that relate to the entire passage. It might say throughout the entire passage, how does the author characterize this thing? And because of that, because the questions may refer to the entire passage rather than a specific part, or because they may refer to multiple different parts, because essentially they tend to be sort of complex, these questions, You want to have a thorough understanding of the entire passage before you attempt to answer any questions. I know for other tests, you may have some sort of skimming method or other method that you used where you didn't, completely read everything before you went to the questions. For the AP language question, let me back up. For the reading passages, specifically, of the multiple choice section of the AP language test, I definitely recommend having a thorough understanding of the entire passage before going to the questions. And what are we going to do? How are we going to get that thorough understanding? Well, we're going to use an active reading strategy. And essentially the idea behind active reading is you are thinking about things as you read. As you read each paragraph, you should be thinking about the following questions. You should be thinking about, what is the main point of this paragraph? How does this relate to the previous paragraph? And how does this relate to the rest of the passage up until this point? You want to know, okay, what is this paragraph talking about? What's the main idea? Is it in line with the previous paragraph? What was the previous paragraph talking about, right? Is it a contrast from the previous paragraph? Is it, maybe a study that is providing more evidence for what the previous paragraph was talking about? How does it relate? And then how does it relate to the rest of the passage? Is it providing evidence that supports the main point of the passage? Is it providing an opposing viewpoint? Things like that. Focusing on these three ideas, these three questions, not only will it give you a stronger understanding of what's going on in the passage, not only will it get you thinking about the ideas that the questions are likely to ask about, it also forces your brain to pay attention, right? You don't want to have a situation, and I know we've all been there, where you read something and your mind is elsewhere, and you get to the end of the page or the end of the paragraph or whatever, and you are about to go to the next page, and you're like, wait a minute, I have no idea what I just read. That's what we want to avoid, right? Because having to reread because you didn't retain the information takes extra time. So thinking about these questions is important for both of those reasons. To get you thinking about the ideas that the questions are likely to ask about, but also because it forces your brain to pay attention. So that's one part of active reading. These are the things you do as you read each paragraph. Another part of active reading is what you do when you come to the end of each paragraph. And that is to simply write a brief note in the margins of what the main point of the paragraph is. So one of those questions that you should be asking yourself anyway, once you get to the end of the paragraph and you have an answer to that question, quickly jot it down in the margin next to that paragraph. And the reason we do this is to create a map of the passage that we can use to locate evidence when answering questions. Just like a quick outline, it doesn't have to be super in-depth, right? A couple of words that kind of get the main point across, create that map. And then when we get to the questions, if a question asks about, I don't know, what the author thinks about blue whales, you can be like, oh, I remember from my map, I can see that in paragraph 4, he talked about blue whales, and you know where to go to find the evidence. That's kind of the point of writing those notes. And there is one final part to active reading, and that's what you do when you come to the end of the passage. After you finish reading the passage, ask yourself the following questions. What is the author's purpose for writing the passage, and what is the author's message? Those are two elements of our rhetorical situation, right? We can have a pretty good idea of what those are, earlier on in the passage, but by the time you get to the end, we should have a definite idea. We should definitely know what the purpose is. We should definitely know what the author's message is. You don't need to write these down. Maybe when you're doing practice, it might be beneficial for you to write these down just so you get used to thinking about it. But you should definitely have an idea in mind before you head into the questions, because a lot of the questions kind of revolve around these things, right? The purpose and the message are kind of the most important components of getting the main idea of a passage, or the general point of a passage. So definitely want to think about those before you head into the questions. Those are our 3 steps. Let's give it a try now. I am going to do I'm going to kind of demonstrate this a little bit for you for the first maybe 2 paragraphs, and then I'll have you try it on your own after that. So it tells us, we of course don't want to ignore this, right? There might be some context there that's helpful. It tells us that the following is excerpted from a political leader's 1836 address to the British Parliament's House of Commons. So you can see this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, right? In identifying a reading passage, it tells us it's an excerpt from some finished existing work, like some real work that actually exists in the real world, not something that was just kind of written for this test. So what is our first step? I have to sneeze, but it's not coming. If I just sneeze at any point, I apologize about that. As our first step with the active reading, as we read each paragraph, think about the main point, how it relates to the previous paragraph, and how it relates to the rest of the paragraph, or the rest of the passage up until this point. So let's get started with those thoughts in mind as we're reading. It appears to me impossible to suppose that the House will consider me presumptuous in wishing to be heard for a short time on this question. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Sorry, it's a little hard for me to see. In wishing to be heard for a short time on this question, one in the highest degree interesting to the people of Ireland. It is whether we mean to do justice to that country, whether we mean to continue the injustice which has already been done to it, or to hold out the hope that it will be treated in the same manner as England and Scotland. That is the question. Okay, so as we were reading, we should be thinking about the main point, right? We don't necessarily need to think about how it relates to the previous stuff yet, because it's the first paragraph. But now we move on to that next step of writing down the brief note as we come to the end of each paragraph about what the main point is. So what is the main point here of this first paragraph? Well, there is a question that he kind of wants an answer to, or something along those lines. And the question is whether we mean to do justice to that country, whether we mean to continue the injustice which has already been done to it, or to hold out the hope that it will be treated in the same manner as England and Scotland. So we don't know what this, well, we do. It says Ireland here. I was going to say we don't know what the country is. We do know what the country is. They're talking about Ireland, and he kind of wants an answer to the question. He wants an answer to the question of whether Ireland will continue to be treated unjustly. That's the main point here, right? He's introducing this topic. The topic is kind of unjustly. Okay, fine. The topic is how they're going to continue to treat Ireland, and he wants to find an answer to that question. So that's our main point here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next paragraph. Again, thinking about the main point, but then also thinking about how it relates to what we've already read. England never did do justice to Ireland. She never did. What we have got of it, we have extorted from men opposed to us on principle, against which principle they have made us such concessions as we have obtained from them. Years are coming over me, but my heart is as young and as ready as ever in the service of my country, of which I glory in being the pensionary and hired advocate. I stand in a situation in which no man ever stood yet, the faithful friend of my country, its servant, its stave, if you will. I speak its sentiments by turns to you and to itself. I require no 20 million pounds on behalf of Ireland. I ask you only for justice. Will you? Can you? I will not say dare you refuse, because that would make you turn the other way. I implore you, as English gentlemen, to take this matter into consideration now, because you never had such an opportunity of conciliating. Okay, what's the main point here? Well, England never did do justice to Ireland. And now he is essentially asking for justice. It said earlier he's addressing the British Parliament's House of Commons. So he is asking for Britain to give justice to Ireland. That's the main point here, right? And how does this relate to the previous paragraph? Well, he is now he's declaring his side here, right? He's saying this is my side, and he's saying please answer the question the way I'm asking you to answer it, right? Please do the right thing. Asking for justice for Ireland. That's the main point here. So there are 3 or 4 more paragraphs here. 3 more paragraphs here. I am going to have you guys try this first on your own. So go ahead, pause the video. I'm going to kind of... Okay, yeah, go ahead, pause the video, and do that same process for the next 3 paragraphs. As you're reading, think about what the main point is, think about how it relates to the previous paragraph, and think about how it relates to the entire passage up until this point. Write a note about the main point down, and then when you get to the end and you're done, unpause. I will go over what I did for those last 3 paragraphs, and then we'll talk about the final step. Don't worry about the final step yet. That after you finish reading the passage step, we'll talk about that together. So go ahead, give this a pause, give this a shot, and unpause when you're ready to go. Okay, let's hop into this and finish it up. Experience makes fools wise. You are not fools, but you have yet to be convinced. I cannot forget the year 1825. We begged then as we would for a beggar's boon. We asked for emancipation by all that is sacred amongst us, and I remember how my speech and person were treated when I had no opportunity of reply. The other place turned us out and sent us back again, but we showed that justice was with us. The noble lord says the other place has declared the same sentiments with himself, but he cannot use a worse argument. It is the very reason why we should acquiesce in the measure of reform, for we have no hope from that house. All our hopes are centered in this, and I am the living representative of those hopes. Okay, so he seems to be now, how it relates to the previous paragraph, right? He seems to be kind of explaining, almost pleading his case a little bit, and explaining that, you know, they've been asking for emancipation for a while, and kind of no one else has helped them, I suppose you could say, or no one else has listened to them, I guess might be better. So now he's kind of saying this is kind of the final hope here, almost in a way. So it's kind of continuing with, you know, trying to maybe persuade the House of Commons to give Ireland its freedom, or its justice that they're looking for. If we looked at the next one, and by the way, if what you wrote down, if your main point wasn't exactly the same, that's totally fine. As long as you're on the same track, right? As long as you're in the same area, you're good. I have not fatigued myself, but the House in coming forward upon this occasion. I may be laughed and sneered at by those who talk of my power, but what has created it but the injustice that has been done in Ireland? If you refuse justice to that country, it is a melancholy consideration to me to think that you are adding substantially to that power and influence, while you are wounding my country to its very heart's core, weakening that throne, the monarch who sits upon which you say you respect, serving that union which you say is bound together by the tightest links, and withholding that justice from Ireland which she will not cease to seek till it is obtained. Every man must admit that the course I am taking is the legitimate and proper course. I defy any man to say it is not. Okay, so he's declaring that he is doing the right thing, and he's also kind of saying that England is kind of weakening itself by denying him, right? It's almost like a what doesn't kill us makes us stronger kind of argument. He's saying that the more you refuse justice to Ireland, the more powerful Ireland becomes, right? While he says, you're weakening the throne while you're wounding my country, essentially. So refusal makes Ireland stronger, we could say. And again, right, it's more and more the relationship, with the rest of the previous paragraph and the passage up until this point are both kind of the same thing. It's just more and more kind of reasons why they should listen to him. He's not providing a whole lot of like objective factual argument. It's a lot of pathos here, right? It's a lot of emotional kind of talking points, trying to persuade through emotion. Condemn me elsewhere as much as you please, but this you must admit. You may taunt the ministry with having coalesced me. You may raise the vulgar cry of Irishman and Papist against me. You may send out men called ministers of God to slander and calumniate me. I don't know that word. They may assume whatever garb they please, but the question comes into this narrow compass. I respectfully insist on equal justice for Ireland, on the same principle by which it has been administered to Scotland and England. I will not take less. Refuse me that if you can. Okay, so this is kind of like his final demand, it kind of as acting as a conclusion almost, right? His final demand, justice for Ireland. He's kind of tying his whole argument together here. All right, so hopefully your active reading was similar to this. Again, doesn't have to be exactly the same, but should be at least in the same sort of vein. Now, our final step. After we finish reading the passage, we'll quickly think about what is the author's purpose for writing this passage and what is the author's message. So if you remember when we talked about rhetorical situation, purpose is what kind of they hope to achieve. It's what they're trying to do for their audience. And message is kind of the main idea, the main point, right? So I think in this case, the message is obviously that Ireland should have justice. Ireland should be emancipated. That's the message. And his purpose is to persuade his audience to agree with him, to persuade his audience to do what he wants. It definitely seems like persuasion is, persuasion's everywhere in here, right? We talked about the pathos in paragraph 4. He's pleading, begging in some cases. In other cases, he's saying, you can deny us, but it's only going to make it worse for you, right? Everywhere through here, he is using persuasive ideas. So, purpose, to persuade, the message, Ireland needs justice. And that's our active reading strategy. It may take more time than you want it to at first. However, the more you practice it, the quicker it'll become, the more natural it'll become. And even if it does take a little bit more time than if you were to just read it straight through, it's worth it. Because not only do you have a better understanding of what's going on, not only are you better prepared for what the questions are going to ask, you also have this map to help you out in finding evidence. Because some questions will tell you where to look, but others won't. And when they don't, the map can help you out quite a bit. Let's talk about the questions now. And again, reading questions, right? We'll talk about the writing portion of the multiple choice section in the next lesson. For reading questions, for every reading question, regardless of question type, it is imperative that you return to the passage and find specific evidence that tells you which answer choice is correct. The entire point of the reading questions and the reading passages is to test your reading comprehension. Every answer comes from the passage. You're not going to, just need to know things necessarily. You just need to understand what's written in the passage. And because of this, there is specific evidence in the passage that will tell you what the correct answer is for every question. Your job is to find that evidence and to match it to what the answer choices say. As I mentioned a couple seconds ago, sometimes the question will tell you which part of the passage to focus on. If it does, that's great, right? Because you can go back, you can reread and focus on just that one area and look for evidence in that one area. If it doesn't, we can use the map to identify where the answer is most likely to be found. So based on what the question is asking, we can look at our map and say, okay, the question is asking about this thing. Our map tells us that this thing is in this paragraph, so I'm going to check this paragraph, right? If the question is asking, what does the author say will happen if they refuse to give Ireland justice? We could say, okay, I remember them talking about that, or not even I remember them, but my map says that they talk about that in paragraph 4, right? Refusal makes Ireland stronger. Let me reread paragraph 4 and find out exactly what they say, and then match it to the answer choices. And questions should be answered based on which answer choice matches the evidence that you found. If you try to answer questions based on what you remember or what you think makes the most sense or what feels right, sometimes you will be correct. It's not like you're going to get it wrong every single time, right? Sometimes that'll get you the correct answer. However, you are opening yourself up to making mistakes. The AP language test is not a straightforward test. It's kind of designed to be tricky because the people that take the test are kind of the more intelligent students, right? The brighter students, the higher achieving students, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It's supposed to be difficult because it's supposed to be for students that feel that like they can handle more difficult things. And because of that, there will be multiple answer choices that have correct components to them. That's why it's so important to match with the evidence, because you could read an answer choice and be like, yeah, that seems right, and circle it, but there's actually maybe one part of it that doesn't match with the passage, or there's one part of it that's missing. And those are the mistakes you're kind of opening yourself up to make if you don't find evidence and match with the evidence. Along similar lines, you should check all 5 answer choices because, as I mentioned, there are often multiple answer choices that are partially right. Partially right meaning they contain some correct elements but also some incorrect elements, or maybe they contain some correct elements and some elements that aren't necessarily wrong but just aren't mentioned in the passage. If it's not mentioned in the passage, right, that can't be the correct answer. If you don't check all 5 options, it's easy to choose a partially correct option instead of the fully correct option that you haven't gotten to yet. If choice A is partially correct, and you're like, yeah, that part makes sense, I'm going to circle A and move on. You're skipping over choice D, which is fully correct, and you would have realized that if you had gotten there, right? So even if you think you found the right answer, you should still check the rest of them, because sometimes you'll find one that works even better. And finally, as I, again, already mentioned a little bit, all components of the answer choice must be correct for the answer choice to be correct. And to test these things, right, to make sure all the components are correct, you can ask yourselves these 2 questions, and you can check for these 2 things. Does every single thing that this answer choice says align with what the passage is saying? Does every single thing that this answer choice says match with the evidence that I found? If not, it might not be the correct answer. In fact, I would say it probably isn't the correct answer. If part of it does not match the passage, it's probably not correct. Similarly, does this answer choice that says induce, it's supposed to say include, information from the passage that answers what the question is asking? If it includes information from the passage, but it doesn't answer what the question's asking, it's not correct. And that's something that they'll do sometimes, right? They'll put an answer choice that is something from the passage, something true from the passage, but it won't be the correct answer choice because it won't answer the question. So those are kind of the 2 things you need to look out for. Does this match with everything from the passage, and does it answer the question? So there are a couple of different types of questions in the reading portion of the multiple choice section, and we are going to talk about all of these question types today. It's a lot of information at once. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed, if you find that I'm going too quick, pause the video, that's fine. You can rewind the video, you can go back and rewatch things. I would recommend that you do that. If you do find yourself kind of not being able to keep up, I will be going fast because it's a cram course, right? I'm trying to get all the information in that you need in only 6 lessons. So definitely, if you need to go back and rewatch things, there's no shame in doing that. Similarly, I wanted to have multiple practice for each of these question types. That way we could kind of do one together, and then you could do one on your own after seeing how we did it together, but it wasn't really feasible to fit it into one lesson that way. So some of these have multiple practice, but a lot of them only have one. If you, again, aren't clear from the practice, you can rewatch, right? Rewind, go back to my explanation, go back to the practice again, and that can help you better understand what's going on. So we're going to start with basic comprehension questions. One other thing, too. These question types all have different methods, slightly different methods, but they all focus on these fundamentals that we talk about, right? They all focus on finding evidence from the passage and matching that evidence to the answer choices.